John Brown, a race communist. Never mind the fact that he was like a fundamentalist Christian. In fact, he thought he was touched like the divinely touched or divinely inspired like the transcendentalists at the time. One night after he got done reading the Bible, he spoke to his family, said, "This is something that I have to do." And after he was executed, the abolitionists up north mourned him as a martyr. So after John Brown was executed, right, he was celebrated as a martyr. The North went wild over him. In fact, let me paint a scene for you. You had church bells going off. You had black bunting being hung out. You had the Minutemen, firing their rifles up into the distance. Prayer meetings being assembled. They even had memorial resolutions that were adopted. And in the following days, they had lithographs of Brown circulated in vast numbers. Subscriptions were organized for his impoverished family, and immense memorial meetings took place in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. His death energized the abolitionist movement. And a lot of the leading figures of the abolitionist movement, from the Transcendentalists, praised him with the highest regard. Ralph Waldo Emerson, paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, "The saint whose fate yet hangs in suspense, but whose martyrdom will make the gallows as glorious as the cross." Henry David Thoreau compared him to the honorable men in the Lexington and Concord battles during the Revolutionary War, except that John Brown was firmer and higher principled than any of those that were in those battles. There was a famous preacher, a clergyman at the time. His name was Cheever, George Cheever, who backed the idea that Brown was divinely inspired by saying, manifestly, God is with him. Frederick Douglass, when speaking about John Brown, said, "The true question is, did John Brown draw his sword against slavery and thereby lose his life in vain? And to this I answer 10,000 times, no. No man fails or can fail who so grandly gives himself and all he has to a righteous cause. No man who is in the hour of extremest need, when on his way to meet an ignominious death, could so forget himself as to stop and kiss a little child, one of the hated race for whom he was about to die, could by any possibility fail." William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of Frederick Douglass's teachers and one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, talking about John Brown, compared him to George Washington, but insisted that the first president had never presented such exalted traits of character as John Brown. Now, all this is going on. All this stuff really, really reinforced the paranoia of the Southern planter class that had been ringing in their heads since the horrors of St. Domingo. I mean, their anxiety had already fucking intensified after Brown's arrest when it was discovered he had support from the Secret Six, which, if you don't know, was a group of wealthy and influential Northern abolitionists who helped fund his plan to start a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry. But because of that whole thing, there was rumors being spread everywhere that more attacks were coming and that enslaved people were plotted murder and mayhem by stockpiling weapons and poison. And some of these radical Southern separatists, or also known as fire eaters, used the conspiracy theories to build public support for secession, along with a lot of Southern preachers convincing that poor whites that they were defending the Christian way of life, that they turned into a holy war. In fact, I did a deep breakdown on that. You can find it on my YouTube, called Holy War. But it was this combination of conspiracies and religious dogma that really radicalized the poor whites to go against their own self-interest and fight against the North, who were coming to take away their way of life because of Northern school indoctrination that made them extreme. Literally the same shit you hear today. But Southern elites brainwashed their people so that way they could potentially one day secede and govern themselves and preserve their slave-based society forever. And now think about that for a second, right? Think about that. Most Confederates were poor and didn't own any kind of slaves. In fact, the institution of slavery hurt them. Never mind how bad slavery was for black people, but poor whites, it was brutal too because they couldn't fucking work. They couldn't get paid. Literally going against their own self-interest, sucking off the billionaire class of that day like they do today. Constantly going against their self-interest because the elites gave them someone to look down on. We're on this fucking 400-year fucking track that we just keep going around and don't fucking learn anything. What's also kind of interesting is that Southern Confederate apologists are obsessed with John Brown, but they never see anything about any other characters, like, say, Cassius Clay, the guy who Muhammad Ali was named after. That man was literally one of the most feared people in the country. He was known to be the most dangerous duelist. He was the most feared duelist in the country because he literally just went around stacking up bodies who were pro fucking slavery. I think they're obsessed with John Brown because John Brown was a symbol and how much he was celebrated. Perhaps that's why it frosts their ass so much. I think it's because John Brown represented the beginning of the end. I mean, I know all historians, they say that Fort Sumter was the beginning of the Civil War. I don't agree with that. I agree with what Frederick Douglass said. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina, but Virginia, not Fort Sumter, but Harper's Ferry, and the Arsenal, not Colonel Anderson, but John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until his blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. That's why I think pro-Confederates, people you see run around today, are obsessed with John Brown and not anybody else. Because there was plenty of abolitionists that did a lot of violent things before the war. But what's most ridiculous about this is that these pro-Confederate apologists, they talk about the founding fathers, how they were patriots who fought for freedom. They don't recognize them as terrorists like the Crown did, right? These were patriots. But yet, when you got guys like John Brown who fought and died for freedom because he was a patriot, well, they're going to label him a terrorist. I just don't fucking get it. Only a brainwashed chowderhead whose ancestors were probably too poor to own slaves would sit around and defend the planter class that waged a war so they could continue owning slaves and not have to pay those poor white people. I don't know. I guess we're just fucking... These fucking conservatives are just... They're never going to get off this ignorant 200-year cycle they've been on. They're always going to fluff their oppressors and go against anyone who wants to fucking try and wake them up to the oppressing that's happening to them. Never able to think for themselves or see the big picture. They need someone to control them and tell them who to be mad at because they cannot think for themselves and they don't know the history of their own country. And unfortunately, with the amount of Christian nationalists running around and this whole authoritarian movement that's rewriting our fucking history, once again, we are destined to stay on this fucking track that we've been on, going around in circles, fighting about the same shit. Anyway, good talk.